It was supposed to be another day in Ethan Whitmore's perfectly engineered life. The air was crisp as his sleek black Maserati pulled up in front of Grace Medical Center, state-of-the-art facility on the brink of receiving a multi-million-dollar expansion, backed by Whitmore Global Holdings. Dressed in a slate gray Armani suit that fit him like memory, Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his shirt and stepped out, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with that quiet authority only the truly powerful possess. This wasn't personal. It never was. Business for Ethan had always been about precision. He didn't cause chaos. He didn't do it messily. He certainly didn't do fate. Hospitals to him were buildings, investments, assets, blueprints until that morning. And fate, as it turned out, didn't need an invitation. The sterile scent of antiseptic wrapped around him as the glass doors slid open with a gentle sigh. His assistant trailed behind, murmuring about press conferences, updated legal terms, and final signatures. Ethan nodded absently, eyes ahead, movements measured. He wasn't prepared for the sound. A scream, piercing, raw, so human, cracked the edges of his reality. Not the kind of sound one forgets. It hit him somewhere deep, a sound both foreign and oddly familiar. He froze. He walked toward the source 1 foot before the other, drawn, not logically, but instinctively. As he rounded the corner near the maternity ward, the world that usually bowed beneath his control began to shift. And there she was, strapped to a stretcher, sweat clinging to her temple, braided hair damp with exertion, lips parted in a silent sob of agony, was a woman he had not seen since that rainy night in New Orleans. Naomi. Time broke. The world collapsed into a tunnel of white light and impossible memory. It couldn't be, but it was. The unmistakable arch of her brow, the deep mahogany glow of her skin, radiant even under the harsh hospital fluorescence. The curve of her lips was now trembling. She hasn't seen him yet. Not really. Her eyes were shut tight, face twisted in pain, fingers clawing at the hospital rails like she was hanging on to something much larger than herself. His lungs forgot how to work. Naomi Carter. The woman who once looked at him not like a billionaire, but like a man. Who made him laugh like he hadn't in years. Who disappeared before dawn and took something with her, something he couldn't name but had never really reclaimed. And now she was here, giving birth. To whose child? His legs turned to iron, and he gripped the edge of the wall like it might anchor him back into logic. But logic failed him. Emotion, once an unwelcome guest in his world, was suddenly the only language he could hear. He hadn't seen her since that night. The conference had ended. The storm had rolled in, and there she'd been standing under the dripping ironwork of a rooftop bar, sipping wine, laughing softly when he told her he hated everything about being Ethan Whitmore. He hadn't meant to tell her that. He hadn't meant to let her in. But she'd listened without judgment and danced with him in the rain, slept in his arms like she belonged there. And in the morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, only the scent of jasmine on the pillow beside him. He'd told himself it was a one-time thing, a lapse, a beautiful accident, the kind of indulgence a man like him couldn't afford twice. But now, as Naomi's stretcher was pushed past him and her eyes vast, wild, glistening, suddenly locked with his, he understood something he hadn't allowed himself to before. That night had never really ended. Not for him. Her expression cracked as she recognized him. Shock, disbelief, fear. Then, the pain overtook her again, and she disappeared behind swinging double doors, carried away by a team of nurses shouting about centimeters and crowning. He couldn't move. Because if what he suspected was true, if those were his children, she was bringing into the world, then everything was about to change. And all the boardrooms, yachts, and marble penthouses in the world wouldn't mean anything compared to what lay behind those hospital doors. Have you ever had one moment that shattered your sense of control? One face that never left your memory, no matter how hard you tried to forget? You're not alone if you feel something stir in your chest while reading this. Share your thoughts in the comments. Where do you think this story is heading? If you want to keep following Ethan and Naomi's journey, one of love, consequence, and second chances, don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. The next chapter might break you. The hallway fell silent after Naomi disappeared behind those white swinging doors. Yet Ethan remained rooted in place, frozen not by fear, but by memory. It wasn't just that she was here. It was how she looked at him. A flicker, something raw and unguarded, pierced through the pain on her face. And he had seen it. Even after months, even with hospital lights washing her in a sterile glow, even with agony curling her body inward. He had seen her, and she had seen him. That was what undid him most. He dropped onto the nearest bench, elbows resting on his knees, face buried in his hands like a man unraveling at the edges. The floor beneath him, the walls around him, the perfectly laid plans of his day dissolved. What remained was the memory of a night so vivid, so real, it now felt more like prophecy than coincidence. New Orleans. A charity gala Ethan had attended out of obligation, not desire. Endless handshakes, champagne flutes, carefully staged smiles for photographers. And then the rain had started. Merciless, sudden, thundering over the city gold. He'd escaped to the rooftop bar, looking for solitude. What he found instead was her. Naomi had been standing alone near the railing, the city lights painting soft reflections in her dark eyes. She was wrapped in a burgundy shawl, curls wet from the drizzle, sipping red wine like it was an old friend. He remembered being caught off guard not by her beauty, though that was undeniable, but by her stillness. The way she wasn't trying to impress the room, the way she seemed untouched by all the performances happening below. He didn't mean to speak to her. He rarely meant to anymore. But something about the curve of her smile pulled words from him before logic could intervene. "You're not dancing," he'd said. She turned to him, her expression both curious and amused. "Neither are you." He smiled, and it felt real for the first time in years. They talked. Under the low lights and stormy sky, they peeled back the layers. She told him about her passion for maternal health care, frustration with underfunded clinics, and her dream of opening a wellness center for single mothers. He told her how exhausting it was, pretending that power ever made him feel full. He confessed, without meaning to, how lonely his life had become, how often he felt like a prisoner in glass and steel. She didn't try to solve him. She just listened. And when the rain grew heavier, they didn't run. They danced. Her laughter had echoed into the storm bold, joyful, uninhibited. And for once, Ethan didn't care who saw. Her body moved with the kind of grace that made time irrelevant. He remembered holding her waist, her hand sliding into his, the silk of her dress sticking to her skin. He remembered thunder cracking above them, just as she leaned in and whispered his name, like it was a secret too tender for the world. They made love that night with the urgency of two people who had nothing to lose, but somewhere between skin and silence, Ethan knew it wasn't just lust. There was reverence in her touch. There was trust in him. And when the sun rose, bathing the room in a soft golden hue, she was curled against his chest, breathing slow, steady breaths. He could have stayed. He should have stayed. But he didn't. Fear, disguised as logic, told him it couldn't last because he didn't have room for softness. Those like Hymen of legacy, burden, and headlines could not afford to want what they couldn't control. So he left. Left her a note that said less than it should. Took the elevator down without looking back. Flew home that morning and buried the night beneath board meetings and mergers. Buried her. He told himself she would forget that it meant less than it felt. But now seeing her again, body writhing in labor, eyes wide with pain, and something that looked a lot like betrayal. He knew he had been lying to himself. It hadn't been just one night. Not for her. And certainly not for him. His assistant had tried speaking again something about the press, the contracts, the hospital director waiting upstairs. But Ethan waved him off, voice low and raw. Cancel everything. How could he talk about growth projections when the woman who once breathed life into his emptiness was just feet away, bringing new life into the world? He didn't even know if they were his. But somehow, that no longer mattered. All he knew was this: he hadn't been there. And if he was a second too late, he might lose more than just the chance to be a father. He might lose the only woman who ever made him forget the weight of his name. He looked toward the doors again, unmoving. How had she not told him? Was it a shame? Fear? Did she think he'd reject her? Or worse, did she believe he'd not care? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the note he had written that morning after their night in New Orleans, now worn at the edges, folded and refolded until the paper softened like cloth. He had kept it all this time, as if some part of him knew he'd have to explain one day. But what could he possibly say now that wouldn't sound hollow? The double doors at the end of the hallway stayed shut, the silence behind them heavy as stone. His pulse thudded in his ears. This wasn't just about a night that had been lost. It was about a future that might never be found again. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Whitmore of power, man of precision, didn't want to win. He only wanted to stay. The sterile light above Ethan flickered slightly, casting soft shadows on the tiled floor beneath his polished shoes. His legs had gone numb from sitting too long on the rigid bench outside the maternity ward. But he didn't move. Not yet. Time no longer belonged to clocks or schedules. It stretched, elastic and unkind, warping every second into a breathless eternity. He had built his life around knowing the numbers, risks, and outcomes. But at that moment, he knew nothing. Only that Naomi was enduring a pain he could neither measure nor mend somewhere beyond the double doors. And possibly, God, possibly delivering his children. He closed his eyes. The silence in the hallway wasn't absolute. It carried weight. The distant roll of a gurney wheel. The low hum of a monitor through the wall. Muffled voices rising and falling like waves. And under it all, his heartbeat. Loud, unsteady, unearned. He had always prided himself on composure. Ethan Whitmore did not waver. But now, every part of him trembled, not visibly, not in ways the world could see, but inside, where it mattered, where the damage settled deepest. He remembered how Naomi looked at him before the doors swung closed. That single glance had leveled him. There had been disbelief, yes, but also fear, and a flicker of something else. Not hate. No, Naomi wasn't cruel. But pain, sharpened by betrayal, nestled in the corners of her eyes. She hadn't expected him to be there, and hadn't wanted him to be. And he didn't blame her. He had left, without explanation, without dignity. He had left her alone after a night that had cracked him open apparently. Everything changed. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, clasped hands pressed to his lips. The air felt heavy in his lungs. There had been other women, of course, polished, practiced, well-connected, but none of them ever felt real. Naomi had. She was. And in just one night, She had unraveled every false truth he had used to justify a life of safe distance. Now, he sat outside her pain, uncertain if he even deserved to know what was happening inside. He remembered how she'd laughed that night when he said he hated his name. "You hate being Ethan Whitmore?" she'd teased, her voice soft with disbelief. "I hate what it makes people expect of me," he'd answered. And she hadn't pushed. She nodded, like she understood, as though she, too, carried a name that bent under history. Like she, too, knew the weight of being defined before being seen. But he had failed to see her in the aftermath. He had treated her like a dream and didn't know how to process it. He wondered what the last 9 months had been like for her. Did she cry alone when she first saw the test? Did she hesitate before choosing to keep the pregnancy? Had she whispered to a growing belly words that should have been his? He imagined her walking into doctor's appointments alone and signing forms with trembling hands and folding tiny clothes in the quiet of some modest apartment while her body ached and her heart broke in silence. He had missed all of it, not because he was a villain, but because he was a coward. And now, he didn't know what terrified him more, the thought that those babies were his, or the possibility that they weren't. Either way, he failed Naomi, and that truth settled in his chest like a stone in deep water. He rubbed his eyes, the skin beneath them raw. A nurse passed him in the hallway, smiled politely, then looked away. No one knew who he was here. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, just a man waiting outside a delivery room, unraveling in his silence. He welcomed the anonymity. For once, he didn't want to be known. He wanted to be forgiven. A low groan came from the other side of the doors. His body jerked upright, breath hitching. But then it was gone. The moment passed, and still, no one came. He remembered the note he'd left her that morning in New Orleans, the poor excuse for a goodbye. It had taken him 5 minutes to write and a lifetime to regret. 5 words. "I had to go. I'm sorry." He had meant to say more, meant to say, "You made me feel like I could breathe. I haven't felt that in years. Please don't disappear." But fear had stolen the pen from his hand. Now, as the minutes bled into each other, he finally understood. Some silences can't be filled with words. Some require presence, steadiness, humility. He had none of those the morning he left her, but now he would wait for as long as it took. If Naomi was fighting to bring new life into the world without him, the very least he could do was sit here and not move. Not until someone told him what he had lost, or what he still had a chance to protect. Naomi Carter had always believed pain had its kind of silence, the kind that presses against your ribs, lingers in your breath, and stretches across the hours like a shadow. But labor taught her that pain could also roar. It was not just in the body, not just in the spine-arching, breath-snatching contractions that made her feel like her bones were breaking open from the inside. It was in the absence, too. The emptiness of the room. The questions no one asked. The faces around her were kind and professional, but none of them knew her. None of them held her hand and whispered, "You're doing great, baby." None of them leaned in with trembling eyes and a shaky smile and said, "I'm here." She was alone. And she had planned to be. Because 9 months ago, she had watched Ethan Whitmore walk out of a hotel suite in New Orleans, like what they shared was a souvenir suite, disposable, forgettable. He left behind a note. Nothing else. And still, when her body convulsed with pain and the nurse shouted that she was crowning, her eyes instinctively, irrationally searched the room for him. That was the thing about heartbreak. You could rationalize it all day long. You could tell yourself he doesn't deserve to be here, doesn't deserve to know. But when the rawness came, when your body trembled from the weight of bringing life into the world, your soul reached for the one it once trusted. And that's why, when she had looked up moments earlier and seen him, really seen him, standing in the hallway like a ghost pulled into flesh, her heart hadn't known whether to scream or to weep. She couldn't process it. There was no time. The moment their eyes met, theirs wide with pain, his with stunned disbelief, reality tilted. Her breath caught, her vision blurred, and the subsequent contraction slammed into her like a wave she couldn't outrun. Now, in the delivery room, Naomi gripped the sides of the hospital bed, her fingernails digging crescent moons into the foam. Sweat clung to her hairline, her hospital gown twisted at the back, and her lower body felt as though it had been claimed by fire. But the fire wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was him. Ethan had always been composed, controlled, the kind of man whose touch could quiet her doubts, if only for a moment. That night, he had listened. He hadn't interrupted and hadn't minimized her dreams, her fears. He had danced with her in the rain for God's sake, held her face like it was made of porcelain, and whispered that she made him forget the world. And then he vanished. No warning, no promise. Just a room left hollow and a memory that wouldn't let her sleep. When she found out she was pregnant, she sat in the bathroom for nearly an hour, the stick balanced on the counter like a truth she wasn't ready to look in the eye. The second line was faint, but it was there. She hadn't cried right away. She'd laughed, quietly, a breathy, disbelieving kind of laugh that sounded more like surrender. Then the fear came. She considered all the options. She kept running through them like a carousel and couldn't step off. Should she call him? Should she tell him? She had composed the message a dozen times. You probably don't want to hear from me, but I'm pregnant. She never sent it. Because what could he possibly say? He had made it clear. His world wasn't meant for her. She was a public health worker with student loans and a part-time second job at a wellness center. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in a part of the city his Maserati would never drive through. And she knew sincerely, shamefully, that if she told him, she might hope. And hope, when crushed, was far more lethal than silence. So, she stayed silent. Went to checkups alone. She wrote in a journal that she planned to give to her child one day. She even chose not to look him up. She didn't want to know if he was dating someone else. And she didn't want to see pictures of him on red carpets or yachts. But still, every kick in her belly made her think of his hand on her waist. Every sonogram, every whispered lullaby she hummed in bed, carried a trace of the man who'd unknowingly left a part of himself behind. And now, he was here. She couldn't comprehend how the universe had folded in on itself to deliver him to this hospital, on this day, at this hour. Was it punishment? Was it mercy? She didn't know. But she knew one thing. She couldn't afford to break now, not when life was arriving. Almost there, Naomi, the doctor said, voice calm, gloved hands poised. One more big push. She bit down, eyes stinging. Tears streamed sideways into the hospital pillow. It wasn't just her body delivering, it was her heart, her history, her solitude. And then, an echo of cries pierced the room. Tiny, beautiful, earth-shaking. And then another. Twins. She didn't look right away. She just closed her eyes. Her body trembled. Her soul stilled. There was only silence again for a brief moment, not emptiness, but fullness. Sacred, exhausted, quiet in the way only love could be. In that silence, Naomi realized something. No matter who stood behind the door or what the future awaited, she had done this. Alone, Yes, but strong. And that strength, she knew, would carry her through whatever came next, even if it was the man who once made her feel everything and left her with nothing. The hallway had grown impossibly still. No nurses bustled past. No phones rang. The world seemed to pause in an absolute hush that even Ethan's breath felt intrusive. He sat forward, spine rigid, palms sweating against the worn fabric of his trousers. Every muscle in his body strained toward the doors that had yet to open. He didn't even realize he was holding his breath until the faint creak of hinges snapped him back into his body. A nurse stepped out young, scrubs wrinkled, her expression unreadable. Her eyes scanned the hall and found him. "Mr. Whitmore?" He was on his feet in seconds, voice low and unsteady. "Yes, she's okay," the nurse said softly. "She delivered twin boys. Both are healthy, both strong." For a moment, the words didn't make sense. They floated, beautiful and terrifying, refusing to land. Twin boys. Not just one. Two. The breath lodged in his chest finally escaped, shaky and hoarse. He didn't speak. Couldn't. His body moved before thought caught up. One step. Another. The nurse pushed open the door without a word, as if understanding that silence now carried more than any permission. He entered quietly. The light inside was soft, muted overhead panels glowing like late afternoon sunlight. The room was still, humming with the subtle machinery of new life. Oxygen monitors, a distant beeping heart rate, the gentle rustle of cotton blankets. And there, in the center of it all, was her, Naomi. She lay reclined in the hospital bed, braids clinging to her damp forehead, her gown loose at the collarbone, chest rising with the slow, shaky rhythm of someone just coming back from the edge. She looked like both a battlefield and a cathedral, and somehow, utterly breathtaking. The strength in her frailty made his throat tighten. She didn't turn when he stepped in, didn't speak, but she knew. He strolled, carefully, not wanting to disturb whatever sacred stillness held the room together. When he reached her bedside, she opened her eyes, barely, and met his. For a heartbeat, they just stared. Everything unsaid between them gathered like a storm inside that silence. And then, in a voice quieter than wind through curtains, she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." He swallowed. Her words weren't cruel, but they cut like glass. "I know," he murmured, "but I am." She blinked slowly, as if the effort cost her. Her eyes were rimmed red from exertion, but still steady, full of that unflinching fire he remembered from that night in New Orleans. There was no screaming, no accusation, just exhaustion, and something far heavier. He moved closer, hesitant. "Naomi," he said, voice catching. "I need to know. Are they mine?" She closed her eyes. And for a terrible moment, he thought she wouldn't answer, that she might send him away with her silence, that he didn't deserve even the truth. But then slowly, like every nod was carved from months of buried pain, she gave him the answer. Yes. Her chin dipped, barely. Once. And just like that, the air left his lungs. The twins were his. Life had arrived in its most raw and miraculous form, carrying his blood. Naomi trembled. The tears came then, not loud, not dramatic, but quiet sobs that shook her shoulders in uneven waves. She turned her face away, covering it with the back of her hand as her body heaved with months of unshed emotion. "After that night," she said, "I didn't know what to do." He sank to his knees beside the bed, suddenly unable to stand. "I thought your world, it would never make space for someone like me," she whispered. "You left without a word. I didn't want to beg to be part of something that never belonged to me in the first place. Ethan felt the shards of her confession pierce his ribs one by one. "I didn't know," he said softly, painfully. "I didn't know, Naomi." She lowered her hand and looked at him, truly. Looked at him, yes, swollen, voice trembling. "But you never asked." He bowed his head, shame closing around him like cold water. He had left something sacred behind, and she had carried it, carrying them without him. His gaze shifted toward the clear bassinet beside the bed. 2 small bundles lay inside, wrapped in pale blue swaddles, their skin a warm, perfect gold, their faces soft and unformed. One had his jaw, the other, something in the brow, in the delicate wrinkle between the eyes, made his chest ache. He reached forward, his hand shaking. One of the infants stirred. A tiny hand, impossibly small, reached upward, fingers curling around air. Ethan's hand hovered for a moment. Then, slowly, he let the tip of his finger brush the baby's palm. The hand closed around his, and the world stopped. No gala, no scandal, no empires, no estates, no expectations. Just this. This fragile miracle he hadn't known he needed. This child, his child. He looked up, eyes shimmering, voice hoarse. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never should have left you." Naomi watched him, lips pressed together, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She didn't say she forgave him. Not yet. But it was enough when she reached out and placed her hand on his over the blanket, over the child they had made together. Not a solution, but a beginning. And for the first time since New Orleans, the silence between them no longer felt like a wound. It felt like healing. 3 days later, Naomi stepped through the carved double doors of the Whitmore family estate, carrying 2 newborns and the quiet weight of her name. The hall was cathedral-like, gleaming marble floors, ceilings that disappeared into ornate gold moldings, and portraits of men with stiff collars and solemn eyes watching from above. The kind of house where voices didn't echo because they weren't raised, where emotions were pressed flat beneath etiquette and power. Beside her, Ethan walked tall, his hand resting at the small of her back with deliberate protection. In his other arm, he cradled one of the boys, Eli, their quieter twin, swaddled in blue, and blinking at the chandelier overhead with sleepy curiosity. Naomi held Jace close to her chest, his breath warm against her neck. She didn't say it aloud, but every step across the gleaming tile felt like walking into a test she hadn't studied for. She had agreed to come because Ethan had asked no, insisted, with a look that bordered on pleading. "Just once," he had said, "so that they see what matters to me." But even then, she had known this wasn't about being introduced. It was about being defended. At the far end of the great room stood Evelyn Whitmore, Ethan's mother. She didn't approach, didn't even blink. She stood tall in a tailored navy dress, pearls gleaming at her throat. Her blonde hair swept into an elegant twist that had likely not moved since sunrise. The kind of woman who didn't need to raise her voice to command a room. Her silence alone could freeze it. Naomi's heartbeat thudded louder than the baby in her arms. Evelyn's gaze swept over them, like a curtain being drawn, eyes pausing briefly on Naomi, then narrowing when they landed on the bundles in their arms. And when she finally spoke, her voice was like ice skimming over crystal. "You cannot be serious, Ethan," she said, "bringing this into our home." She didn't raise her hand, didn't gesture, but Naomi felt it all the same. This. The word didn't need clarification. It slithered through the air, sharpened by contempt, polished by generations of silent exclusions, and it landed squarely between Naomi's ribs. She held Jace tighter. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, directly between Naomi and the woman who had raised him. His voice was low, steady. "These are my sons," he said, each word deliberate. This is my family. Speak to them with respect, or don't speak at all. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but her silence cracked slightly, like porcelain under pressure. She's not our kind, she said, almost calmly. She doesn't belong in this world, Ethan. And now you've made a public mess. Do you understand what this does to our name? Our legacy? Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't cry. But something in her gaze sharpened. She had been called invisible before. She had been underestimated. But this cold disdain masked in manners, was an old kind of violence. And she had learned long ago how to stand inside it without breaking. Ethan stepped in again, but Naomi touched his arm gently. She didn't need a shield. She stepped forward, just enough for her voice to carry, not loud, not confrontational, but calm in the way truth often is. I didn't come here to be tolerated, she said. I came because the father of my children wanted to share his life. I'm not here for approval. I'm not leaving, but I don't need your welcome. There was silence, and then a soft shift from the room's far corner. Ethan's father, Richard Whitmore, had been sitting in the high-backed chair beneath the oil painting of their estate founder. He'd remained quiet the entire time, a glass of something amber untouched in his hand, his gaze thoughtful and unreadable. Now he stood. Slowly. He crossed the room, not to Ethan, not to Naomi, but to the bassinets that had just been set down near the window. He looked down into them, and for a long moment said nothing. Then, as though speaking to himself, he murmured, "They have your eyes, Ethan." Something shifted in the room. Not much, but enough to break the frost. Evelyn didn't soften, didn't apologize, but she didn't speak again either. "And Naomi?" she breathed. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was a crack in the armora beginning. Later, after the formalities faded and the children began to fuss, Ethan led Naomi down a hallway she had never walked before, toward a wing of the estate most guests never saw. He had prepared a room, for her, for them. It was warm, quieter than the grand foyer, a space where the curtains swayed gently with the afternoon breeze, and a soft cream rug cushioned the polished floor. A crib stood near the window, already set up. 2 bassinets, a changing table stocked with supplies. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, shoulders slack for the first time all day. She looked at Ethan. "Do you think we won?" He turned to her, his jaw tense but his eyes kind. "We won the first battle," he said. "The war's just starting, but you're not alone in it." She nodded once, and as she cradled her son, rocking gently in the hush of their temporary refuge, Naomi thought about legacy. Not the kind built on portraits and pearls, but the kind born from choice, from voice, from love that refuses to be erased. She didn't need to belong to their world. She was here to build her own. Later that evening, under a sky the color of bruised silk, the Whitmore family's annual charity gala shimmered to life. The estate transformed, lanterns glowing from every tree branch, polished marble glinting beneath $1,000 shoes, and servers weaving through silk gowns and tailored tuxedos with flutes of gold-tinted champagne. Everything gleamed, rehearsed, and perfect, as if the air had been instructed to behave. But behind the refinement, the whispers had already begun. The scandal had traveled faster than the invitations. Ethan Whitmore was arriving with her, with them. It wasn't just gossip. It was an inheritance on the line, the family legacy, generational expectations rewritten in one breathless week. Inside the estate's grand ballroom, Naomi stood near the French doors, trying to will her lungs into rhythm. Her gown was deep emerald satin simple, sleeveless, with a neckline that grazed her collarbone and fell like water to the floor. Her hair was swept into a soft crown of braids, a single curl left free at her temple. She looked regal, but she didn't feel it, not with eyes crawling across her like measurements, not with silence sharper than words, not with a room that didn't know how to make space for her and didn't care to learn. She could hear the murmurs behind fans and champagne flutes. Is that her? She's pretty, I suppose. Did you hear it was twins? No wedding ring. She's not from New York, is she? It would have been easier to pretend she didn't hear, but she did. Ever the shield, Ethan hadn't left her side since they entered. He looked immaculate, black tuxedo crisp, cufflinks catching the chandelier light, his jaw set in that familiar quiet defiance. You don't have to stay long, he said lowly, voice brushing her ear. We'll leave whenever you're ready. Naomi turned to him, holding his gaze. I'm not leaving. Not tonight. She had carried life in her body for 9 months, in silence. She had walked into rooms alone that were built to shut her out. She had faced pain, judgment, and the weight of a decision that reshaped her entire future. She had earned her place, not just beside him, but within herself. And now, she was going to stand in it. Ethan's expression softened, not in surprise, but in awe. He held his palm up, and she placed hers in it. Together, they stepped forward into the light, into the hush that fell across the room like the first drop of rain. The music stilled. Forks paused mid-air. And then, Ethan did something no one expected. He let go of her hand and walked toward the center of the ballroom. A single microphone stood waiting, positioned for announcements no one had truly been listening to all evening. Until now. He adjusted the mic. Naomi could feel the tension coil through the room like a wire pulled too tight. Ethan looked around, gazed steady, and spoke. Good evening. I know many of you have questions tonight. Some of you have already concluded, and some of you, they are still whispering them. He smiled. Not bitterly, not performatively, just truthfully. So let me answer what you won't ask out loud. He turned slightly, his eyes finding Naomi across the room. This is Naomi Carter. She is the mother of my sons. She is the woman I love. And she is the only part of my life that makes me proud without a single dollar attached to it. The air thickened, but he wasn't finished. I know what this family values. I've been raised in it, groomed by it, and yes, sometimes wounded by it. And I've spent years chasing a version of success that left me empty at the end of every gala, just like this one. His voice dipped, quiet but unshakable. But tonight I choose something different. He stepped aside, as if making room for something sacred. I choose love. I choose truth. I choose the family I created, not the one I inherited. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, a few claps began, polite, unsure. But they grew, they rippled, they became real. And when Ethan returned to Naomi's side and slipped his arm around her waist, it wasn't just an embrace. It was a vow spoken not in church or law, but in defiance of every room that once made her feel unwelcome. She leaned into him, chin high, eyes clear. And the whispers? They didn't stop, but they no longer mattered. Because in a ballroom gilded with history and expectation, Naomi had become more than a name in a scandal. She had become a name in the room, and she was never leaving it again. It was still dark when Ethan gently pulled the car into the gravel drive, the soft hum of the engine blending into the early morning hush. In the back seat, the twins slept soundly, their tiny chests rising in rhythm beneath knit blankets. Naomi sat silently beside them, her head resting against the window, her thoughts drifting like fog. The Whitmore estate was behind them, its chandeliers, velvet walls, and quiet cruelties. Neither of them had spoken much since the gala ended. They didn't need to. The night had spoken enough for both. But now, as the headlights swept over a narrow, tree-lined road and curved around a final bend, Naomi blinked, slowly straightening in her seat. Because what appeared before her was something she had never expected. A house. But not the kind she was used to entering quietly. Not the type that bristled with judgment in every corner. No, this house waited. It sat on a slight hill, wrapped in climbing roses and morning stillness, the porch light casting a soft golden hue over the pale stone exterior. The windows glowed faintly from within, like they had been waiting to welcome someone home all night. Naomi didn't speak as Ethan stepped out of the car and moved to open her door. She looked up at him, eyes cautious. "What is this?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just reached in, gently lifted Eli from his carrier, and nodded toward the house. "Come inside," he said softly. "It'll make more sense there." Naomi followed, carrying Jace against her chest, the baby's sleepy sighs warming the hollow of her neck. Her feet hit the porch steps lightly, the wood creaking beneath her heels. Not grand like the marble halls she'd walked, but real, honest. Inside, the house unfolded like a memory she hadn't lived yet. The floors were warm, honeyed oak, smooth beneath a vintage rug patterned in soft blues and creams. The walls were painted in pale hues that reminded her of dawn, gentle, forgiving. And everywhere, bookshelves, soft chairs, expansive windows, was intention. This wasn't a showpiece. It was a home. She turned slowly, her eyes landing on a framed photograph on the console table. A candid shot. Her laughing, head tipped back, a braid lock falling loose. A moment from New Orleans. She didn't remember being captured. She blinked. "You had this?" she whispered. Ethan stepped behind her. "I never really let go." Naomi turned to him, searching his face, not for guilt, apology, or sincerity. And she found it, pressed quietly into the lines of his eyes. "You bought this place?" she asked. "For us?" He shook his head. "Not exactly. I started building it, long before I knew if there'd be an us. It was just a blueprint back then, a dream I didn't understand yet." He moved past her and opened the door to a room just off the hallway. It was a nursery. 2 cribs, handcrafted and side by side, their names carved delicately into the wood. Jace, Eli. The ceiling above was painted like the sky pale blue with watercolor stars. Faint clouds brushed near the corners. A mobile spun slowly, its tiny golden moons catching the light. Naomi stepped inside on instinct, as if her body recognized the space before her mind caught up. "How did you—" "You once told me," Ethan said behind her, "that if you ever had kids, you'd want them to fall asleep under stars, even painted ones." She smiled, slowly and trembling. Her fingers trailed over one of the crib railings. "You remembered." "I remembered everything." He moved closer, lowering Eli gently into one of the cribs, adjusting the blanket without a sound. Naomi placed Jace in the other, her heart thudding against her ribs. She stood there a moment longer, watching both boys sigh into sleep, and wondered how long it would take before this no longer felt like a dream she didn't deserve. When she turned, Ethan was still watching her. There was something quiet in his eyes. Not fear, not regret, but hope threadbare and sincere. He took her hand, slowly leading her through the hallway, past the kitchen with its pale marble counters and vintage tea set she once told him reminded her of her grandmother's. past the sunroom already stocked with her favorite books, and out onto the back porch. The garden took her breath away. Roses, everywhere. Not sculpted into manicured hedges, but wild, intentional colors spilling into one another. Soft petals dusted in dew. A narrow stone path was winding through it, and benches were tucked under trees draped in fairy lights. Naomi stepped forward as though in a trance. How did you know? Ethan's voice came from behind her, low and steady. You told me once, just in passing, that you dreamed of waking up somewhere the air smelled like roses. She turned to him. And for the first time since the hospital, since the confrontation at his mother's house, since the whispers and the stares and the storm of that gala night, Naomi let herself feel it. All of it. The tenderness of being remembered. The ache of being wanted not in a moment, but across seasons. The staggering, quiet miracle of being chosen not once, but again. Every day. She reached for Ethan's hand and laced her fingers with his, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain. I've never belonged anywhere, she said. Not really. Ethan stepped in closer, his forehead almost resting against hers. You belong here, he said. You always did. And as the first light of morning slipped through the trees, illuminating the porch, the garden, and the woman who had once felt like a fleeting dream, but now stood wrapped in homegrown roots, Naomi realized something accurate and straightforward. This wasn't a place Ethan had built for her. It was a place they would grow together, brick by brick, day by day, until even the walls knew her name. The sun came slowly to their new home, unlike the estates Ethan had grown up in, where blackout curtains swallowed mornings and staff moved like shadows behind walls. This house welcomed the light. It poured through the expansive windows, fell gently across wooden floors, and warmed the linen drapes that swayed with the soft hum of early wind. Naomi woke to the smell of tea. She blinked, still curled beneath the quilt, her hand resting where Ethan's warmth lingered. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear a lullaby off-key and soft, sung in a voice that had once only known power and now stumbled through tenderness like a new language. She smiled into the pillow. When she finally sat up, wrapping the robe around her and padding barefoot down the hallway, she found him in the nursery. The morning sunlight spilled in from the east window, bathing the room in pale gold. Ethan stood by the window with Jace resting on his shoulder, one of his large hands patting the baby's back in a slow rhythm, while the other adjusted a tiny cap over the boy's curls. Naomi paused in the doorway, watching. This wasn't the man she had first met in New Orleans. Ethan wore ambition like armor and charm like currency. This man barefoot in cotton sweats, his hair mussed, his voice a raspy murmur singing something made up on the spot. This had stripped away the layers. And still, what she saw beneath was not weakness. It was a strength, made tender. He noticed her and smiled, the kind that reached his eyes first. He spit up on me at 3:17, he said dryly, and again, at 4:10. I think he's trying to assert dominance. Naomi laughed, stepping in and brushing a hand down Jace's tiny back. He takes after his father. I refuse to be slandered before breakfast. She took the baby gently, cradling him in her arms, and leaned into the window light. They stood in a hush, made only of breath and the soft shifting of baby limbs, like the world outside had paused to give them room to belong. These were the new rhythms of their life. There were no grand speeches, no declarations. These are just tiny rituals stitched into the fabric of their days. Ethan tiptoeing into the nursery before dawn so Naomi could sleep a little longer. Naomi was warming bottles with one hand while bouncing Eli on her hip. Shared smiles over burp cloths, kisses on tired foreheads, silent acknowledgments exchanged through glances in the middle of midnight feedings. It was messy and imperfect and real. Later that week, they sat together on the nursery floor, folding miniature socks into pairs while the twins dozed in their bassinets. Naomi rolled one pair and paused, holding the fabric up with a look between amusement and disbelief. "Do you realize these are the tiniest things we've ever owned?" Ethan smirked. "And yet, they take up the most space." She looked at him, his hair still damp from the shower, sleeves pushed up, collarbone visible beneath a soft Henley, and felt a warmth settle low in her chest. "You're different," she said quietly, almost to herself. He looked up. "Is that a good thing?" She nodded. "It's a beautiful thing." He reached for her hand, fingers brushing against hers like a question. "I didn't know I could be this version of myself," he admitted. "But then again, I never had a reason to become him until now." Naomi's throat tightened, because she understood. Motherhood had changed her, too. She wasn't just a woman anymore. She was the guardian of two hearts, the keeper of rhythm, the soft landing for tiny bodies that hadn't yet learned fear. And with that came a power that humbled her every day. They didn't talk about forever, not directly, but they lived like people who had quietly decided they would stay. And their house, still new, still unbroken by time, began to shift. It learned their habits, their sounds, the places where they paused to kiss, the hallways where Naomi sometimes sang to herself while carrying the laundry, the windows Ethan leaned against during late calls, a baby cradled to his chest, the nursery where lullabies overlapped with whispers about dreams and fears, where tears were held without shame. Every evening, they met on the back porch, just the two of them. The garden is in bloom. A baby monitor is on the table, and mugs of chamomile. They rarely finished. They sat wrapped in a blanket, Naomi's head on Ethan's shoulder, her legs tucked beneath her, his fingers playing with the ends of her braid. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But always, there was a presence. One night, she looked at the roses swaying under the fairy lights and whispered, "I never imagined this. Not after you left. Not after I found out I was pregnant. I didn't imagine it either," he replied. "But it was the only thing I couldn't forget." She turned to him. "What changed?" she asked. "You," he said, without hesitation. "You changed me. Not with demands, not with ultimatums, just by being you. The memory of you was the only thing I wanted to earn back." Naomi didn't cry. She just reached for his face, cupped it gently, and kissed him slow, soft, and full of every quiet yes her body had been carrying since the day he walked back into the hospital hallway. Later that night, after the twins had been fed, burped, and tucked in for the third time, Ethan found her in the nursery again. She was sitting in the rocking chair, one hand on Eli's chest as he slept, the other rubbing slow circles across his back. She didn't notice him at first. Her lips were moving, barely. He moved closer and realized she was praying. Not out loud, not formal, just whispering thanks. Thanks for the breath, for sleep, for softness after so much hardness. He didn't interrupt. He knelt beside her, rested his head against her knee, and listened. Because in that moment, he knew no grand gestures could measure up to this. No corporate victory, no title, no accolade. Only this. The quiet holiness of being needed, of being known, of being forgiven, without ever being asked. And when Naomi bent to kiss the top of his head, her lips brushing the curls there like a benediction, Ethan closed his eyes and let the rhythm of her love lull him deeper into the only life he ever wanted to live. A week passed, and with it came a rhythm soft, gentle, slightly off-tempo, but uniquely theirs. Naomi noticed the minor details. Ethan always turned the kettle off just before it whistled so it wouldn't wake the twins. How he kept a journal now, left open on the counter, filled with scribbles and half-finished thoughts about parenting, memory, fear. His voice lowered when he entered a room where she was sleeping, not because he had to, but because reverence had become instinct. But even in the stillness, some things remained unsaid. One evening, the quiet of the nursery was broken by a sharp cry, Jace, wailing in a way Naomi hadn't heard before. It was sudden, raw, piercing through the walls like grief. Naomi rushed in first, lifting him with trembling hands. Ethan followed, his face pale, concern etched into the furrow of his brow. What happened? I don't know, Naomi said, pressing Jace against her chest, swaying, whispering. He was fine a minute ago. But the crying didn't stop. It grew. And behind it, a more profound fear began to rise, irrational but real. The kind that told you something was wrong, even when logic hadn't arrived yet. Ethan took out his phone. We're going to the hospital. Naomi didn't argue. The emergency room was flooded with fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells. The twins, now both slightly feverish, were taken in for observation. Nurses moved with practiced precision, asking questions that Naomi tried to answer through a haze. Ethan stood by her, his hand resting gently on her back, grounding her with his silence. They sat together in the family waiting room, hours blurring. Finally, a young pediatrician came out, his face calm but serious. They're stable, he said. Looks like a reaction to a mild viral infection. Nothing alarming, but their systems are still fragile, especially since they were born a bit early. Naomi exhaled, her body slumping into the chair like something inside her had finally released. They'll keep them overnight, just for monitoring. She nodded, then looked up. And for the first time, she noticed Ethan wasn't looking at the doctor. He was staring at the floor, frozen. Ethan? She said, placing a hand on his arm. He didn't blink. Ethan, his jaw clenched, throat tight. Naomi gently touched his face, like coaxing a frightened child out of hiding. And only then did she see it. The memory flooding behind his eyes. A hospital room. A child. A silence that had never been broken. You've been here before, she whispered. He turned away, but not before she saw the rawness surface. Avery, he said, the name barely a breath. My sister. Naomi didn't speak. She waited. She was 6. Fever spiked one night. My parents waited too long to take her in. They thought it was just the flu, but it was meningitis. By the time we got to the hospital, it was too late. He closed his eyes. I held her hand that night, and when she went quiet, I thought maybe she'd stay if I didn't let go. Naomi's chest ached not just from his story, but from how he told it. Flat, like something rehearsed into numbness. I never talked about it, he added, almost apologetic. Not even in therapy. I built skyscrapers instead, bought companies, created futures that had no room for the past. Naomi reached for his hand and held it, firm and steady. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. He looked at her, and something inside him cracked, not loud, not catastrophic, but the gentle breaking of a long frozen river, finally giving way to spring. They stayed at the hospital until morning. The twins, wrapped like little suns in pale blue blankets, slept under careful observation. Naomi dozed with one arm resting across both bassinets. Ethan sat beside her, his hand never leaving her back, fingers tracing invisible circles between her shoulder blades. At dawn, a nurse whispered, They're both doing well. You'll be able to take them home later today." Naomi exhaled deeply, nodding, but Ethan stood, stretched, and almost shyly asked, "Could I hold them for a bit?" She looked up at him, surprised. "You never asked before." "I was scared," he admitted. "Not one of them. Of me." She didn't say anything, just stood and stepped aside. He approached the bassinets, hands steady now. He lifted Eli first, cradled him gently against his chest, and strolled toward the window where the light spilled through soft gray clouds. Then he spoke, just barely loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "I missed the beginning, but I'm here now." Naomi felt tears press against her lashes, but she didn't wipe them away. Instead, she sat quietly, watching, witnessing. And when he returned Eli to his bed and took Jace into his arms with the same tenderness, the same quiet awe, she realized something devastating and straightforward. This was a man learning how to love all over again. Not with declarations, not with diamonds or grand gestures, but with arms open, with fear faced, with time finally redeemed. The house didn't feel the same when they returned home that afternoon. It had softened. It was as if it, too, had waited outside the hospital room, listening. That evening, Naomi lit a single candle on the kitchen island and made soup from scratch. Ethan held both boys in the living room, telling them a story about a tree that loved a bird so much that he grew branches to cradle her, even when she flew away each winter. After the babies were asleep, they lay in bed, Naomi's head resting against Ethan's chest, her fingers tracing the faded scar beneath his collarbone. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked softly. "All the time," he whispered. "And does it still hurt?" "Yes," he said honestly. "But not in the same way." Naomi nodded. "Maybe some pain doesn't disappear. It just changes shape." He kissed her head, his lips lingering longer than usual. And as the candle flickered quietly downstairs, they let the silence between them hold the rest. Because sometimes, love wasn't found in fixing what broke. Sometimes, it was found in holding the pieces, gently, reverently, and choosing, every day, not to let go. The days unfolded calmly, like notes on a piano softly finding each other. Naomi started waking earlier, not out of necessity, but from instinct. The kind of instinct that forms when you're tethered to another life. She would slip out of bed just as the sun began to paint gold into the corners of the sky, wrap herself in a cotton robe, and tiptoe down the hall to the nursery. It was her sanctuary. Not because it was decorated beautifully, though it was, with warm neutrals and soft fabrics, but because it was where her sons breathed, cooed, grew, where they reached for the world without fear, where they belonged without question. She liked to watch them sleep, one hand cradling a warm mug of tea. Sometimes she whispered stories to them, stories with no beginning, no end, just fragments of hope, healing, and quiet truth, and quiet. This morning, she was mid-sentence in one of those whisper stories when Ethan appeared in the doorway. He said nothing at first, just leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his face half in shadow. How he looked at her made something shift deep in her chest, like he was seeing something not with his eyes, but with memory, with knowing. "You used to do that when you thought no one was listening," he said. Naomi glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Still do." He stepped into the room, slow and quiet, like he didn't want to break the spell. "What do you tell them?" She considered. "The truth. In the way only babies can hear it." He smiled and leaned down to kiss Eli's forehead, then Jace's. "Tell me one." Naomi looked up at him. A story? He nodded. She tilted her head. Once, a man had everything but didn't know how to hold it. Not because he didn't want to, but because he was too afraid he'd break it. Ethan's smile faded, but not out of discomfort. He was listening, deeply. One day, she continued, he met someone who didn't ask him to hold anything. She just stood still, patient, real. She didn't rush him, didn't try to fix him. She just existed. And in that stillness, he learned to be gentle. Silence stretched between them, long and rich. And, he asked. Naomi shrugged softly. He's still learning. Ethan stepped closer, hands sliding into his pockets. And the woman? She's still choosing, Naomi said. Every day. Not because she has to, but because real love isn't loud. It's a quiet, relentless decision. Something flickered in his eyes, then that familiar, guarded ache. Naomi, he said after a moment, I've been thinking about something. About who I am in this house, with you, with them. It feels like the most honest version of me. But I also know what exists outside these walls. My name, my legacy, all the things I've touched that weren't built to hold someone like you. She didn't flinch. He went on. I'm trying to say, I don't want to live two lives anymore. I want one. With you. With the boys. I want to merge them. Naomi set down her mug and stood, wrapping her robe tighter. Merging isn't easy, she said. It means there are pieces we'll have to leave behind. People will disappoint us, and parts of ourselves we'll have to confront. I know. Do you? He stepped forward again, slow and sure. I've spent my life chasing perfection. But you've shown me that love isn't about finding something flawless. It's about holding something even when it trembles. Her throat tightened. He reached for her hand. I want you to come with me, he said, to the board meeting next week. I want to walk in with you and the boys. I want them to see us, not as a scandal, but as truth. I want them to know that my family starts here, that you are the person I build for now. Naomi studied him. There was no performance in his eyes, no polished statement, just an unguarded man asking to rewrite the lines that had once excluded her. She nodded slowly. All right. The following Thursday, Naomi stood before a mirror in a tailored cream blouse and high-waisted navy slacks. Her curls were pulled into a sleek twist. Simple, elegant, deliberate. Ethan entered the room holding two tiny bow ties. She laughed softly. No one's going to see them under the blankets. He shrugged, grinning. Still feels important. As she took the bow ties and began gently fastening them to the twins' collars, Ethan stood behind her, watching. You look like power, he murmured. I look like motherhood. Exactly. The boardroom was sterile. Long glass table, men in suits, women in tailored silence, the kind of space designed to reinforce distance. Until Naomi walked in with one baby in her arms and Ethan behind her, carrying the other. The room fell into hush. Naomi didn't look down, didn't shrink. She took her seat beside Ethan, eyes meeting the chairman's. Calm, unapologetic. Ethan cleared his throat. I know this isn't traditional, he began, but neither is the future I want to build. He placed his hands on the table, palms down. This is my family, and if there's no space for them here, then there's no space for me either. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her presence was the sentence that echoed longest in the room. Later that day, back home, Naomi watched Ethan play with the boys on the living room rug, his laughter unguarded and his suit jacket tossed aside. She sat quietly on the couch, ankles crossed, a journal in her lap. And for the first time in years, She allowed herself to write not about endings, but about beginnings. Because sometimes love wasn't a lightning strike or a single climactic moment. Sometimes love was this: a truth spoken across a table, a bow tie chosen for a child too young to care, a woman sitting in a room she was never meant to enter, and choosing to stay anyway. It started with a drizzle. The kind of rain that doesn't ask permission, arrive, quiet, insistent, familiar. The city dimmed under a silver sky, and the Whitmore estate, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and manicured stillness, became a sanctuary wrapped in gray. Naomi stood barefoot in the kitchen, the hem of her silk dress brushing the tops of her feet. She was making tea slowly, methodically. The twins were napping. The house was quiet, except for the steady rain tapping against the glass. Ethan entered without a word, still in his dress shirt, sleeves rolled up, collar slightly open. His presence filled the room the way dusk fills a window softly, without ceremony. "I didn't know you were back," Naomi said without turning. He came closer, his voice low. "Board meeting ended early. I wanted to be home before the storm got worse." She poured 2 cups, one for herself, one for him. It was their new ritual, carved in the silence between the loud chapters of their lives. They sat by the window, hands warming porcelain mugs, eyes watching the rain etch stories onto the glass. For a while, they didn't speak. Then, as if the question had been waiting all day for space to land, Naomi asked, "Do you ever feel like the life you had, the one before me, is still tugging at you?" He didn't answer right away, but she didn't fill the pause. She let it breathe. Ethan set his mug down, his fingers interlocked, his gaze distant. "It's not that it tugs. It's more like it lingers, like a ghost of a version of me that never knew how to be soft." Naomi's lips parted, but he held up a hand gently. "I chased everything that glittered because I thought it would make me worthy. Of legacy, of control, of love maybe. But then, you came back into my life, not quietly, but not loud either, and suddenly, all that noise faded." He looked at her then, thoroughly, and I realized I had never truly been with someone, until I sat beside you silently and still felt full. Naomi's throat tightened. The tea in her cup had gone lukewarm, untouched. She set it aside and rose. "Come with me," she said, offering her hand. He took it without hesitation. Outside, the rain had thickened, but not with violence. It was steady now, gentle, like fingers brushing piano keys in the dark. Naomi led him to the backyard, barefoot, her dress already soaking at the edges. She turned to face him under the open sky. Ethan stared at her, half in disbelief, half in wonder. "You'll get soaked," he said. "I already am," she replied with a soft smile. She stepped closer. "This is who I was before everything else, before the hospital, before the gala, before the boardroom. Just me, in the rain, not caring if I looked foolish." He looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd never asked out loud. "I used to dance in storms," she whispered. "When I was little, my mama would shout from the porch, but I never listened. I'd spin until I couldn't tell if I was wet from rain or joy." "Dance now," Ethan said, voice husky. "Show me." Naomi closed her eyes and tilted her face to the sky, and then she moved, not in practiced rhythm, but in memory. Arms out, body swaying, a quiet joy lighting her from within. It wasn't a performance. It was a remembrance. Ethan didn't speak. He just watched, rain trailing down his face, unmoving, as if she'd conjured a dream he was afraid to disturb. Then she reached for him, and something inside him gave way. He stepped into her orbit, tentative at first, his movements unsure. But Naomi didn't guide him. She just kept moving, letting him find his way. And slowly, they began to turn together. Two souls in the soft gray hush of the evening, letting the rain wash away everything they weren't. He pulled her close, his arms around her waist, their foreheads touching. Their breaths mingled, their heartbeats stilled. In the distance, the city kept pulsing. Cars kept moving, and people kept living. But here in this sliver of time, nothing else existed. Only the storm. And the two of them chose to stand in it, not as an escape, but as a baptism. Later that night, wrapped in thick towels and dry clothes, they curled together on the living room rug, a fire crackling nearby. Naomi's head rested against Ethan's chest, and his fingers gently traced the outline of her shoulder. "I never imagined love could be this quiet," he murmured. "It's not quiet," she replied. "It's just not loud in the way we're used to. It's steady, like rain, like breath." He kissed her hair, long and slow. "Naomi," he whispered, "I want to marry you." She didn't move, not right away. Then, she pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Because you think it's the right thing? Or because it's the only thing you want?" He didn't flinch. "Because I've spent a lifetime running from the wrong things. And now I want to run toward something. Toward you." Naomi searched his face, her gaze soft but unwavering. "I don't need a ring to know we're real." "I know. But if we do this," she said, voice quieter now, "we do it on our terms. No headlines. No family politics. Just you and me. The boys. Maybe a treehouse and a witness." Ethan smiled. "And rain. There has to be rain." She laughed. "Of course. Always." In the silence that followed, their hands found each other again. And outside, the storm began to fade. Not because it had passed, but because they had chosen to stay in it together until it became part of their story. Not a threat, but a chapter, and a beginning. The house felt different in the early hours before the world stretched itself awake and returned to its demands. There was something sacred about the hush, as if even time dared not interrupt. Naomi stood by the window of the nursery, a worn paperback resting in one hand, the other gently swaying Jace in her arms. His tiny fist clutched her blouse near the collar, warm breath dampening the silk where he nestled. Eli slept soundly in the crib behind her, one chubby arm flung across his face in that careless way children sleep when they trust the world entirely. She wasn't reading. She hadn't turned the page in 10 minutes. Her eyes were lost beyond the glass, in the pale blue sky, not yet committed to sunrise. And her thoughts drifted slowly, tenderly, like waves brushing a familiar shore. Downstairs, the quiet creaked, the old wooden steps, a kettle warming, the occasional shifting of floorboards as Ethan moved through the house. He had started rising before her now, making breakfast and smoothing chaos before she stepped into the day. Not because he felt obligated, but because he had finally understood that love wasn't grand gestures, it was choosing someone in the smallest moments and proving it again and again. Her mind wandered to their conversation the night before. Marriage, a vow made not in spectacle, but in stillness. She could still feel the echo of his words, "Run toward you," like warmth, curling through her chest. Naomi had never thought she'd want to say yes to a man again. Not after the way silence had filled the spaces where promises once lived. But Ethan wasn't the man he had been. And perhaps more importantly, neither was she. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Then, gently, his voice. "I made you something." She turned, her expression softening. He carried a small tray tea, perfectly steeped, toast cut just the way she liked, and a note folded beneath the cup. He placed it on the dresser and approached slowly, careful not to disrupt the baby in her arms. He leaned in, brushed a kiss against her temple, and whispered, "Come downstairs when you're ready." Naomi watched him leave, the curve of his shoulders in the pale morning light, and then turned her eyes to the note. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she inhaled deeply, memorizing the quiet, the warmth of Jace, the rhythm of a moment that would pass before she knew it. And then, with the softest motion, she slid the note from under the cup. In his handwriting, always slightly slanted and neat, were just a few words. "Let's rewrite the story." Later that day, they visited her mother. It was a simple apartment in the Bronx, where the furniture was old, but the laughter was always new. Naomi hadn't brought Ethan here before, not because she was ashamed, but because she had needed time. It was time to be sure this new version of their love could stand in both worlds. When they arrived, her mother, Elise, stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel and eyeing Ethan like a storm that had once passed through and might return. Naomi held her breath. Ethan extended his hand. "Mrs. Carter." She didn't take it immediately. Then, after a moment that lasted far too long, she nodded and gestured inside. "You can call me Elise, if you take your shoes off at the door." He smiled, slipping off his Italian leather shoes like a sacred ritual. "Yes, ma'am." Naomi held back a laugh. The conversation was slow at first, polite, edged. Elise asked the kind of questions that didn't sound like questions. "You always this quiet, Mr. Whitmore?" And Ethan answered with the type of honesty that didn't try too hard. When Naomi excused herself to feed the babies in the other room, she left them alone intentionally. She stood near the hallway, out of sight, but close enough to hear. Elise spoke first. "My daughter's been through more than most women I know. She gave birth alone, built a life with nothing but strength and spit. You know that?" Ethan's voice didn't waver. "I do. You plan to break her again?" "No." "You sure?" A pause. Then, "I think about the ways I failed her every day. But I don't live in shame anymore. I live in the choices I make now." Naomi's heart tightened. Then Elise said, "She loved you before you deserved it." "I know. Do you deserve it now?" Another silence. Then, with a rawness that stripped every layer, "I'm still learning how." When they left, Elise kissed her daughter and hugged her longer than usual. And to Ethan, she said only, "Don't forget tea takes time to steep. Don't rush it." He nodded, understanding more than her words. That night, Naomi and Ethan lay side by side in bed, not touching, not speaking, just listening to the twins breathing in the next room, to the city murmuring through their windows, to how peace feels when it's earned. Naomi whispered, "She's harder on you than she lets on." "She loves you," Ethan replied. "That's not hard. That's grace." Naomi turned toward him, her voice barely audible. "When I first found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. Not just of being alone, but of what it would make me. I didn't want to become bitter. I didn't want to hate you." "You didn't," he said. "No," she replied. "But I hated the silence." Ethan reached out, his fingers threading with hers. "There won't be silence anymore." And in that moment, beneath the weight of every word they hadn't said before, beneath the quiet of their shared bed and the soft breath of sleeping suns. Naomi closed her eyes, not to shut the world out, but to let it in. Because love, she'd come to learn, isn't a door that opens all at once. It's a slow, deliberate turning of the handle, and she was ready. It was one of those days when everything moved more slowly, like the world had been lulled into a dream. The kind of day where you watch sunlight slip across the floor and forget that time is passing at all. A rare Sunday without meetings, without visitors, without a single thing pressing down on the chest like responsibility often does. Naomi stood in the garden behind the estate, her hands buried in the soil, the scent of rosemary clinging to her fingertips. The twins napped upstairs, and the wind, soft and fragrant, carried the sound of distant laughter from a neighboring street. She overlooked Ethan at first. He stood in the doorway, watching her. No suit, no tie, just jeans and a pale gray shirt, the sleeves rolled up, his face unshaven from the lazy rhythm of the weekend. There was something startlingly boyish in how he stood, one shoulder leaning against the frame, arms folded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're spying," she said without looking up. "I'm studying," he replied. "Dangerous habit. Only if you're caught." Naomi sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on a rag, then tilted her head toward the open chair beside her. Ethan walked barefoot across the grass and sat down, letting the sun warm his skin, the quiet filling the space between them. "Do you miss it?" she asked after a while. "Miss what?" "The chaos, the pace, the version of your life that never stopped moving." He took a breath, letting it out slowly. "I thought I would. I built my identity around momentum, around being in 10 places at once, around closing the next deal before anyone else even saw it coming." Naomi waited. "But now?" Ethan looked out at the horizon, his eyes soft. "I've never felt more like myself than I do in stillness. Especially with you." She leaned back, watching a butterfly drift across the lavender stalks. "Funny how everything they told us we needed to be was just noise." He turned to her then, serious now. "You taught me that." "No," she said. "I just stopped performing long enough for you to remember you didn't have to." Ethan reached for her hand, brushing his thumb across the small crescent scar near her knuckle, something he'd noticed weeks ago but never asked about. "I want to take you somewhere," he said, still tracing that faint mark. Naomi raised a brow. "Now? Next weekend? Where?" "It's a surprise." She narrowed her eyes. "You know I hate surprises." "I know," he said, smiling. "But I also know you love stories. And this one, you need to see with your own eyes." The following Saturday, they left the city behind. Ethan drove, refusing to share the destination. Naomi sat beside him, wearing sunglasses and a quiet smirk, legs folded beneath her, sipping iced tea from a thermos she'd made that morning. The landscape changed slowly, glass and concrete melting into vast fields and winding roads. Trees pressed close to the edges, wildflowers nodding as they passed, and the sky opened wide as if giving them room to breathe. When they arrived, Naomi stepped out of the car and stilled. They were on a small cliffside property, overlooking a narrow water inlet framed by weeping willows and wild ivy. The cottage before them was weathered, but beautiful stone walls, shuttered windows, and a porch with 2 wooden rocking chairs that looked like they'd heard every version of love and loss. Naomi turned to Ethan, lips parting, heart caught between surprise and disbelief. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "It was the only place in my childhood that ever felt kind." She looked around, taking it in. "Why here?" Ethan walked a few steps ahead, his voice carrying in the wind. "I used to come here when things got too loud. when my parents were at each other's throats, or when I felt like I couldn't breathe beneath their expectations. He paused, turning back to her. I came here the weekend I found out you'd left New York. Naomi's breath hitched. I stood right there, he said, pointing toward a tree shaped like a bent harp, and thought about calling you and begging you not to go. But I didn't, because I thought silence was safer than rejection. Naomi stepped closer, her hand finding his. I would have answered, she said softly. I know, he replied. I just didn't believe I was worthy of forgiveness back then. They walked together down to the water's edge, where tall grass danced in the breeze and dragonflies skimmed the surface like sparks. There, Ethan pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. Not dramatic, not diamond-studded, just simple wood carved with initials. He opened it. Inside, instead of a ring, lay a folded note. Naomi took it with trembling fingers and read silently. This is not a proposal. It's a promise. No matter how many versions of life we walk through, this one or the next, I will always find you, and I will always choose you. She looked up. I don't need a ceremony, she whispered. I just need this. Ethan nodded, pulling her into his arms. They stood like that as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the rippling water, across the soft curve of Naomi's cheek, across the space they had rewritten with something more substantial than forgiveness. Love, when quiet, becomes a place. And in that place, beneath the trees and sky, they didn't need to speak to know. They were already home. It was the kind of morning that didn't announce itself loudly. No dramatic sunrise, no roaring wind, just the quiet unfurling of soft light across white linen sheets, and the gentle hum of the world beginning again. Naomi lay still in bed, her body wrapped in the warmth of a man who now belonged to her not by contract or apology, but by the quiet, deliberate choosing of every day since. Ethan's breath was slow and even behind her, his arm draped over her waist with a familiarity that no longer startled her, but grounded her. The window was open just slightly, letting in the scent of pine and morning dew from the lake beyond. In this house, nothing asked to be rushed. And for the first time in years, Naomi didn't feel like she was running from something or toward something. She was exactly where she needed to be. Later that morning, the boys squealed with delight as they toddled through the kitchen, clinging to chair legs, smearing jam on everything they touched. Eli had discovered his reflection in the oven door, babbling to it with wild hand gestures. No matter how often Naomi redirected him, Jace was determined to climb into the bottom cabinet. Sitting barefoot with a spatula at the stove, Ethan watched it all, like a man watching his favorite symphony. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who gets excited about making pancakes, he said, flipping one onto a plate with surprising precision. Naomi arched a brow. And yet here you are, domestic god. He grinned, sliding the plate toward her across the island. You say that like it's a downgrade. I say that like it's a miracle. She meant it. Not just the pancakes, the peace. The fact that the same man who once ghosted her in a sterile Manhattan apartment now kissed syrup from their son's cheeks and remembered which stuffed animal belonged to which twin. This version of life slower, fuller had not come without ache. But it had come. That afternoon, they took the boys down to the lake's edge. Ethan carried Jace in one arm and a folded blanket in the other, while Naomi walked beside him, holding Eli against her hip. The grass was damp, still kissed by the morning's mist, and the sun drifted gently toward the west. They laid the blanket down beneath a tree where the light flickered through the leaves like old film, slow, golden, almost nostalgic. Naomi lay back, her eyes to the canopy above, while the twins played with blades of grass and giggled at the wind. Ethan reached for her hand. "I've been thinking," he murmured. "Dangerous." He chuckled. "I want to write something." She turned her head toward him. "A book?" "Not quite." His thumb traced the back of her hand. "A letter. To them. For when they're older." Naomi smiled softly. "What would it say?" He looked up at the sky. "That the most important thing I ever did wasn't building an empire. It was learning how to love someone well. And that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is admit when he's been wrong and fight to become worthy again." Naomi was quiet, letting the breeze carry his words between them. "I want them to know that," he continued, "that love isn't about perfection, or timing, or deserving. It's about showing up, over and over, even when you're scared, especially when you're scared." She leaned closer, brushing her lips against his temple. "They'll know, because they'll watch you." After the boys were asleep that evening, they returned to the porch. Naomi wore one of Ethan's old shirts, too big, too soft, perfect, and curled beside him on the porch swing. A lantern flickered beside them, casting dancing shadows on the railing. Somewhere in the distance, a lone owl called into the night. "I used to be terrified of quiet," Ethan admitted. "Why?" "Because it left space for the things I didn't want to feel." Naomi nodded slowly, her voice low. "I know that kind of silence, but now—" He paused, pulling her a little closer. "Now it feels like the truth, like I can finally hear my life speaking back to me." Naomi closed her eyes, and in that silence, the wind shifted gently through the trees, the stars blinked in and out like ancient promises, and the earth turned without fanfare. Their story had begun in a hospital hallway, with a breath, a heartbeat, a truth too big to deny. And somehow, through mistakes and missed chances, through ache and courage, through all the versions of themselves they had outgrown, they had found this. Not perfection, not a fairy tale, but something better, a life, real, quiet, unfolding. And still, the light found them. Years from now, long after the twins had grown out of their toy-strewn afternoons and into the complicated beauty of adulthood, the house by the lake would still stand. Not in perfect shape, its wood would weather, the paint would fade, and the garden would be a little wilder than Naomi once kept it. But it would carry the quiet, unshakable echo of a family that had been built with fierce tenderness. On a summer morning with mist floating over the water and dragonflies stitching gold threads across the reeds, Naomi sat alone on the old porch swing. Her hair was streaked with silver now, but her eyes still held that steady warmth, like a fireplace that had never gone out. She wore a robe Ethan had given her decades ago, frayed at the cuffs but still impossibly soft. The porch creaked beneath her feet, and her hands curled around a worn book of poems, pages dog-eared from nights spent reading beside the man who had changed her life, not by rescuing her, but by returning changed, ready, and real. Inside, Ethan was humming a tune she'd never quite placed. He never sang the lyrics, just let the melody drift through the house as he poured their coffee, the scent of it curling into the air like a memory that refused to fade. Their love hadn't been perfect, but it had been patient, and it had lasted not in grand gestures, but in the small things, the extra sugar in her tea, the blanket he laid over her knees when she fell asleep on the couch, the way she knew his silences didn't mean distance anymore, but presence. She looked toward the lake and saw two tall figures walking along the dock, Eli and Jace grown now. But still her boys are deep in conversation, arms moving as they debate something that likely didn't matter, but somehow still did. The way brothers speak when there's nothing left to prove and everything to protect. She smiled. In those boys, she saw the echoes of a life well lived. The curve of Ethan's jaw, the fire in her gaze. The softness came not from ease, but from the resilience of a heart that had chosen to open again after everything. Later that evening, Ethan sat beside her on the porch, a blanket shared between them, as the stars took their places overhead. They didn't speak much. At this point in life, they didn't need to. Their silences were filled with years of laughter, arguments that ended in understanding, kisses that turned routine into something sacred. "I was thinking," he said finally. "Always dangerous," she replied, her smile crooked, familiar. "I want to leave this house to them." She looked over. "The boys?" "No," he said. "Them too. But I mean everyone. People who come after. People who need stillness, the way we once did." Naomi blinked, caught off guard. He continued. "A sanctuary. For single mothers who need a place to breathe. For fathers who've made mistakes and want to learn how to come home again. For people who don't know yet. Love doesn't always arrive on time, but it does arrive if you make room." Tears welled in her eyes. "You're serious," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "It saved us. Maybe it can save someone else." Naomi didn't answer with words. She took his hand and placed it over her heart. They sat like that, two souls wrapped in light and memory, in forgiveness and forward motion. And if you walked by the lake years from now, you might find a cottage with laughter inside, and windows always open to the wind. You might see a porch swing that sways without a touch, and a garden wild with lavender and rosemary. And you might feel something in the air. Not nostalgia exactly, but the soft, undeniable truth of a love that had been tested, broken, mended, and made whole. A love that endured. A love that taught them, and now perhaps teaches you. Because sometimes, the most incredible stories aren't the ones that end in fireworks, but the ones that unfold in quiet rooms, in forgiven hearts, in the unglamorous but unshakable decision to stay. If this story touched something in you, if you saw a piece of yourself in Naomi or Ethan, or if you believe in the kind of love that takes its time, don't leave quietly. Leave a word, a thought, a memory in the comments below. Like the story if it resonated. Follow for more journeys like this, crafted in light, layered in heart. Because somewhere, someone is waiting for their second chance. Their story may begin right here,